Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's roundtable discussion by the International Relations and Foreign Policy Cluster from Nickel and Dimed on the topic the geopolitics of cultural heritage, history, art, and identity as power. We have with us our panelists Shivali Yadav, Tarini Gupta, and Vasatika Saraswat. Thank you so much to all of you for joining as we look forward to a fruitful discussion today. Cultural heritage. When we think of it, it's easy to picture monuments, artifacts, or traditional art kept in museums. But cultural heritage isn't just about the past, it's deeply tied to how nations express power, pride, and identity today in the present. Take the Kohinoor diamond, for example. It's not just a precious stone, it's a symbol of colonial legacy, global contestation, and national pride. And it's far from the only object that tells such a story. Around the world today, heritage is being used to reclaim narratives, assert sovereignty, and even shape diplomacy. It's becoming more of a soft power tool and a diplomatic bargaining chip. In this roundtable, we'll explore how the politics of the past are playing out in the present today and how cultural heritage is shaping the geopolitical landscape in ways we do often overlook. So let's start by looking at how cultural heritage shapes a nation's identity. Around the world, we're seeing countries fight to reclaim lost artifacts, revive traditional practices, and reframe historical narratives. And these moves aren't just cultural, they're obviously very political. They affect how a nation sees itself and how others see it. So we start with the first question. How does the control or reclamation of cultural heritage shape national identity and a country's international standing in today's geopolitical landscape? Shivali, we'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Thank you so much for the question. I think the first thing we need to clarify is basically that culture and heritage both have become this very subtle but very potent weapon almost in shaping national identity and the global influence. So, on both scales, it is being used as an instrument to shape them. And like you mentioned, cultural heritage goes way beyond just monuments and manuscripts or what you might expect in a museum because it also includes all the intangible things that form the nation's identity. So this can be language, this can be food, clothing, music, even oral traditions like storytelling. All of these come under kind of the umbrella that culture forms. And so when we look at it from this perspective, there's two concepts that become very important, which are heritage making and heritage regimes. And it is these concepts and these processes that countries are increasingly turning to shape culture in a way that they can use. And heritage making basically refers to this process of the state or whoever is in power essentially deciding what parts of culture they should be preserving, what parts they should be promoting, and what parts they should effectively be suppressing. And heritage regimes is also similar in that sense because it shows this kind of deliberate system where they are valuing and preserving certain cultural elements to reflect their identity on the world stage. And these two processes, we can kind of view it through examples of India as well as China. And for example, India, now that we see this kind of push for a cultural renaissance, we can see that through how India is kind of focusing and globally promoting, not just on a national scale, but globally promoting yoga, Ayurveda, and all of these traditional, like Indian traditions on the global stage, as well as trying to repatriate stolen artifacts, for example, the Kohinoor diamond and stuff. So, the way that India is choosing to selectively elevate certain traditions, a criticism of this could also be that it often ends up reinforcing the kind of majoritarian view of history because you're selectively choosing what you are promoting. But
Hmm.
this kind of cultural diplomacy has become very key in India's foreign policy, which we can see even when you see how India uses its vast range of diaspora to kind of celebrate the International Yoga Day, for example. Now, when we come to China as well, which is another very like relevant example of using culture, it China builds a cultural narrative that can align with the political agenda of the party state. For example, China is known for a very aggressive usage of the UNESCO lists because China has the largest amount of entries on both the World Heritage Site as well as the Intangible Heritage Site lists. And even the Border Road Initiative, they are kind of portraying it as almost a re-invocation of the Silk Road. So again, we see this kind of usage of history and of culture in present day, in contemporary times, to solidify that, almost legitimize their endeavors. But this kind of reclamation can come at a cost again, which can lead to homogenization. So when you see ethnic minorities like Muslims and Tibetans, they have raised complaints that their culture is being suppressed in favor of a unified culture. Now, this matters on an international stage because, like you said, culture, when it's used effectively, it does become soft power. And the best example of this would be South Korea's global boom, because you see that a lot of South Korean elements are like kimchi, K-pop, all of those have become globally renowned. And this is a result not only of that culture, but specifically that the state is supporting and exporting those cultural elements. And even like the boy band BTS, it's come to the extent that they were invited to the White House because of this cultural influence. Similarly, we can see this in Japan with anime and tea ceremony as well. So the thing is, these shift from kind of just being cultural products to identity markers and diplomacy tools. Again, very recently, King Charles and Queen Camilla were greeted with the
Hmm.
song Dhoom Machale while they were walking
Hmm.
down the Commonwealth Day ceremony. So it kind of shifts from being just a song to being an identity marker for India. And it's these performances that help it become an image that attracts, it can attract, say, tourists, it can attract investors and allies, which is what makes it so relevant for the global stage. And again, like we mentioned, the flip side of this is that it tends to flatten the culture because, for example, regional dialects might be ignored or in favor of national languages, or folk practices might go unseen in favor of more popular or touristy practices. But like you mentioned very correctly, at the end of the day, culture is about how citizens see themselves and also about how the world sees them. Thank you.
Thank you for that very thoughtful start, Shivali, and for mentioning the Dhoom Machale song, which I'm very sure that it's become a symbol of soft power for India very unintentionally at the end of the day. So, okay, so moving on, that idea of heritage shaping identity leads naturally to another important layer, which is conflict. Now, because when heritage is contested, when artifacts are disputed, or when sites around the world are claimed by more than one group, it often becomes a symbol of something much, much bigger. And these aren't just agreements over random objects. They're now struggles over legitimacy, history, and who gets to be remembered and how. So, our next very important question for the discussion is, can disputes over cultural artifacts and heritage sites be seen as symbolic struggles for historical legitimacy and power in global politics, and how? Vasatika, we'd love to hear your take on this.
Thank you so much for the question. So I feel that disputes over cultural artifacts and heritage sites, they can absolutely be seen as symbolic struggles for historical legitimacy and power in global politics. And they're deeply tied to a nation's like identity, post-colonial justice, and also global redistribution of power and knowledge. So like cultural artifacts and heritage sites, they're not simply objects or ruins, but they contribute significantly to a nation's self of self and collective memory. So, for example, when we see Egypt demanding the Rosetta Stone or like Greece demanding the Elgin marbles, they're basically asserting a right to define its own history, a claim to sovereignty, not just over
Hmm.
land, because that is a really important aspect, but also over narrative. So when that essentially brings us back to colonialism and like the politics of plunder, basically. So the removal of artifacts during colonial rule was not just opportunistic or capitalist, it was systemic and ideological. Colonial powers have often portrayed colonized societies as uncivilized or incapable of protecting their own heritage, which is now justifying their uh, like taking of the artifacts as preservation. And
Hmm.
now the calls for repatriation, they don't just become historical, they become acts of historical redress. They're not just museum debates. And so when we look at heritage sites in particular, they are basically ideological battlegrounds because you can make them a target of nationalist branding. For example, you can look at the Hagia Sophia in Turkey. They're shifting the museum back to the mosque. It can also be a act of cultural cleansing, like if you see Taliban and its destruction of the
Hmm.
Bamiyan Buddhas. It can also be a territorial claim, like the disputes over the Temple Mount or Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. So, control over such sites also includes control over historical narratives, the- and it can also correlate to religion and politics. It can be like a marker of religious authority and political legitimacy. So, in the end, museums, you realize that museums are not just neutral spaces; they actually curate and display artifacts in a way that can shape the public understanding. And I feel like this is where the like the criticism for the British Museum and the Metropolitan Museum House, it becomes very relevant because they have thousands of artifacts from former colonies and they present them from a Eurocentric lens. Like over here, the debate for the Kohinoor, like the way Shivali pointed out, it becomes so much more prominent because it's a constant reminder of what has been lost and what has still not been reclaimed. So, keeping these artifacts abroad allows these imperial powers to continue some sort of epistemic control, about how history is told and remembered. And this sustains global hierarchies of power and knowledge because we often like to act like we are now going away from the colonial past and we are globalized. But like West is seen as a custodian of world heritage, and that is how they kind of continue a claim over these objects because they are reinforcing neo-colonial dynamics. Um, like even now, when we see recent debates, institutions in the global north, they are often resisting repatriation and they are citing reasons like better preservation facilities or legal technicalities like statute of limitation and documentation gaps and like the idea that these artifacts are some sort of universal heritage of mankind. These sort of debates come up again and again, but these defenses they often serve to like legitimize continuing uh, Western control, I would say, and also obscure the colonial violence. Because if we treat them as universal heritage of mankind, we are kind of ignoring about how these were procured, and it's like a remnant of a very dark colonial past and the violence which is now not being considered when we bring up legal technicalities, which I find really confusing. Uh, and now, again, going back to the idea of soft power and global reputation, as Shivali pointed out, repatriation can affect a country's global image and soft power. Like, for instance, like if we look at the example of France, and like when they were asked to return the looted African artifacts, they signaled a new attitude towards like post-colonial engagement when they returned them. So this was a symbolic shift. It can be a rebranding. It can be like a shift from being exploitative to cooperative. And it can signal moral leadership, like by refusing those who ignore the relics of colonial past and treat them as simply objects and not a part of someone's heritage. That is why activists, scholars, and even artists are continuing to push for a decolonization of museum and heritage sites. So basically, in conclusion, I would say that these disputes are deeply political and they are not simply uh, historical or legal. They are battles over who gets to tell a story, who gets to define identity, and who gets to hold power over memory. So I would also say that they are unfinished business of colonialism and it's sort of an ongoing struggle for cultural sovereignty. Because we are still often, as a world, like as a global economy, we are still marked by our imperial legacies. So I would say that they are like a front line in the fights of like historical legitimacy and global power. Thank you.
Very well said, and thank you, Vasatika, for that. And you have very beautifully articulated the idea of ethical cleansing, which, in my opinion, needs an entire discussion in itself, and how countries are hiding behind the veil of showcasing these artifacts in a very politically correct manner. So that brings us to the idea of that idea of legitimacy now brings us to one of the most sensitive areas in the geopolitics of heritage, which is colonial legacy. Now, many of the world's most prized artifacts were taken during colonial rule, and today there's growing demand for those items to be returned. But how these conversations unfold, who apologizes, who resists, and who actually returns says a lot about where global power today still lies. So here's our next question. How are former colonial powers and post colonial nations negotiating the politics of restitution and repatriation today? Tarini, what are your thoughts about how these dynamics today are playing out?
Thank you for the question. So, getting right into it, I think the politics of restitution and repatriation is a very dynamic and politically sensitive area in international cultural diplomacy today. It's not just about returning objects, it's more like a broader negotiation over memory, justice, and power. So, cultural heritage, whether it's in the form of sacred idols, manuscripts, regalia, or even human remains, it was taken through violence, coercion, or even very devious legal frameworks during the colonial rule. So these objects, they're not just artifacts for the colonies. They're deeply symbolic of identity, dignity, and nationhood. Reclaiming them will be more like asserting sovereignty over history and correcting narratives that were shaped by imperialism previously. So nations like Nigeria with the Benin bronzes, India and Egypt, they've recently been being more vocal about recovering what they see as stolen heritage, and they're trying to leverage diplomatic channels, media campaigns, and international frameworks for this. And obviously, former colonial powers are very hesitant with this question. Many museums and cultural institutions frame themselves as universal stewards of global history, arguing that they acquired these objects legally and that they are better preserved, studied, and displayed better in Western contexts. This is also something Vasatika pointed out.
Mm.
There is also a lingering fear that returning these items could set a precedent, which would prompt a flood of claims that would empty European collections. This is also reflected in the legal versus moral debates. What may not be legally mandated is still increasingly seen as a moral obligation. But we are seeing a shift. So, France and Germany, like mentioned before, they've begun to return looted items. So, France returned 26 of the Benin bronzes back to Nigeria. And we can see that these moves are signaling a willingness to reevaluate such legacies, but they're very selective and very slow. So, this full scale restitution is still a contested process. But what is particularly very interesting to me is how repatriation has become a geopolitical tool now. Restitution and repatriation can be used to improve international relations, reshape how nations frame their images, and project soft power. China, again, like previously pointed out, is aggressively trying to reclaim its lost cultural assets as a part of a larger nationalistic project of cultural rejuvenation. Similarly, the United Arab Emirates, their investment in projects like the Louvre Abu Dhabi shows how they're trying to uh, assert their power in place by using by in cultural hierarchies, global cultural hierarchies. So ultimately, restitution is not just about returning what was stolen. It's also about who has control over the narrative, who tells history, who gets to decide
Mm.
what counts as heritage, and whose voices have been historically excluded. These are questions that are at the very core of this discussion. And while some progress has been made, this process is still very deeply political, which reflects a very wider and an unfinished conversation about colonialism, historical accountability, and the current post colonial present. Thank you.
Very well said, and thank you for that, Tarini. And thank you to all our other panelists for this incredibly thoughtful and wide-ranging discussion. And after this discussion, I'm sure that we can say that cultural heritage isn't just about preserving the past. It's about defining the present and influencing the future. Whether it's the fight to reclaim artifacts, the struggle for recognition, or the politics of restitution, heritage is now deeply woven into how every nation projects power and asserts identity. And these aren't just old objects or monuments, they are stories, they are memories, and in many ways, they are claims to land, history, and dignity. As the global order continues to shift, the way we handle cultural heritage will obviously reflect what kind of international community we want to become. One that acknowledges history with honesty and respect, or one that continues to bury it under powerful struggles. And we've talked about all those issues in depth, a very thoughtful discussion. At the end, I'd like to ask all of you for your key takeaways from this discussion and anything you have to conclude our discussion today. Shivali, we'll start with you.
I think the major takeaway I've take from this discussion is basically that even though they might try to position culture and cultural artifacts or even heritage sites as this neutral place where they're just signifying what their country means, it is a deeply political decision, not just in terms of using those artifacts and those sites as a way to push their agenda onto the global stage, but also about which sites make it into that list in the first place. So not just the selection of sites, the selection of artifacts, the selection of what parts of culture get a place in history and in the narrative, that is political, and the usage of those elements to portray and to extend the agenda that they are trying to influence onto the global order is also deeply political. I think that is the major thing that I've taken away from today's discussion.
Satika?
Yeah, so I agree that this is like a really relevant and contemporary uh, conversation that we've just started having. And whether it's through
Mm.
courtrooms or UN debates or museum protests or anything, the struggle over cultural heritage is fundamentally a struggle over power, legitimacy, as well as identity in the global order. Because we're still shaped by the aftershocks of colonialism and the empire. So I also believe that these disputes and these conversations, they involve more than just property. They are remnants of stolen voices and asserting cultural autonomy, like the way Shivali pointed out. And they're also challenging imperial narratives, the way we continue to view history from this one lens. It's about creating a sort of space where different cultures can coexist and also claims like as we're seeing now, many contemporary conflicts are coming up, like the Bamiyan Buddhas, the Ayodhya dispute, the
Mm.
Priyavaya temple, the Maori artifacts. It's just a continuing conversation that needs to be had in a civilized and respectful manner. And hopefully the global north will continue to engage with this and, we'll have more Dhumachale moments in the future.
Very well put, Satika. Tarini?
Yeah. So to wrap up, I think it's important to remember that the question of restitution and repatriation, it's not just about returning objects, it's about how we choose to remember the past and what kind of relationships we want to build in the future globally. For former colonial powers, this can be a chance to acknowledge historical wrongs, and not just in words, but through actions. And for post colonial nations, it's a chance to reclaim not just property or objects, but also agency and narrative. So while returning these artifacts may seem symbolic, its impact is very real. It can reshape how nations relate to each other, how people connect to their own history. That I think is where the true power and essence of restitution lies.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining in. And that concludes our discussion today.
Thank you.